Welcome back. The MeToo movement, founded by social activist Tarana Burke 10 years ago, went viral in October 2017 as a hashtag used on social media to help demonstrate the widespread prevalence of sexual assault and harassment. It followed soon after the public revelations of sexual misconduct allegations against Harvey Weinstein and has since continued to shed light on both perpetrators and victims of sexual assault. This has also given rise to conversations about sexual assault in the Muslim community, including a focus on incidents happening in places of worship and holy cities like Mecca through the hashtag Mosque MeToo. How do we even begin to make sense of this? Let's talk to Dr. Shabir Ali to learn more. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So we're talking about the Me Too movement, and I think the reason we're having this discussion is because we wanted to start the discussion from the perspective of an imam and a community leader. So right off the bat, I want to ask you, have you dealt or come across cases of sexual assault or things within that nature?
Yes, there have been cases, and of course we read more about these on the news than situations where people will come to the imam. It seems that this is not something that people come to imams with, and that itself is a problem. We need to let the community know that imams can actually deal with situations like this. And imams, of course, need to be trained to deal with situations like this. They need to be sensitive to the issues, and the community has to have that sense that this is no longer a private matter. It needs to be dealt with and dealt with even if it means publicly.
Now, you made a very interesting point where you said that people don't generally come to imams. So, with the Me Too movement, I think there's a widespread now, this idea where women are no longer feel silence and they feel like they do have a platform and a voice to say what's happening to them and for people to listen to them. Do you think are you noticing that that's also the case? Do you think there's a shift within the Muslim community, or do you think we still have a far way to go?
I think we have a far way to go, and most recently I was shocked to learn that some women have reported that they have been harassed even while they were performing the most sacred rite of Islam, the pilgrimage. And that is totally unacceptable. We cannot imagine that this is happening, but we have to listen to women who are reporting their real experiences.
So, my other question is perhaps one of the reasons I think that maybe women don't feel comfortable talking about it is because within the Muslim and Islamic community, just the idea of talking about anything that has the word sex in it, including sexual assault, is sort of hush hush, we can't discuss it, you're not allowed to discuss it in a public forum. Nobody explicitly says this, but this is sort of an underlying, okay, we don't talk about it. And, do you think, is this something Islamically, what is should we be talking about this? Is there an element, because I've also heard the argument, it's about modesty, so therefore you shouldn't talk about it. What's the Islamic take on this?
Of course, in many things there is no set rule, but communities evolve and people look at what is harmful and they try to avoid harm. So if at a certain stage in the development of the Muslim societies there is an understanding that haya or modesty is to rank supreme, because this modesty leads to a greater degree of chastity and avoidance of sexual interactions outside of marriage and so on, then that's how the communities evolved. But while the good side of that modesty is that it did have this desirable effect, but at the same time it had a side effect in that there are many cases of sexual harassment and assault and even incest that have remained hidden behind closed doors and within families. And the victims of such harassment and molestation did not have an avenue to voice their grief, and they had to bear their grief personally and privately and live with that until they died. So this is harm. And as we recognize this harm, we have to go back to the basic Islamic principle, la darara wa la dirar. There should be no harming or of oneself or harming somebody else. So that is such a basic principle that we have to see that when harm occurs, we have to take measures to remove that harm. And if we have overemphasized the shyness and haya and modesty to the extent that people cannot even complain when they have been harassed, well then we need to strike a balance here where yes, we're not throwing haya and modesty out the window, but at the same time we have to create the space for people to express their real life experiences, especially when they have been harassed or molested.
So you mentioned the Hajj, where women are talking about, being harassed during Hajj, and that movement is starting to take rise, I think, through the hashtag #MeToo. I personally know of friends growing up who were sexually harassed by their uncles, Quran teacher, etc. The list goes on and on, unfortunately. So is there, reflecting back on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and even from the teachings of the Quran, are there any lessons or anything we can take away from there about these types of situations and how we should handle it, not only as women, but as maybe more so for the community?
It is mentioned that there was a man who he betrayed some feminine features, and the story goes that he used to freely move about among the women folk at the time. But then it was found that he would see the women in a state of undress, which was fine because they didn't feel any threat from him. But then he would go reveal to others what he saw. And when this was the case, it is mentioned that the Prophet, peace be upon him, put a stop to his interacting with the women at that level. So that shows that there can be some intervention. In the Quran, it is mentioned that there were some men who were harassing the women, and they're known as hypocrites in the Quran. And the Quran threatens them in the 33rd chapter that if they do not cease their behavior, then the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, would banish them from the city. So that shows that there has to be intervention at the state level, at the level of leadership, to protect women from harassment and molestation, from rape and so on, and that the men who perpetrate such acts must be dealt with according to law. And of course, it's not always men who are perpetrators. Yeah. It can sometimes happen the other way as well. Sometimes it's a power issue. The one who is in power uses the power to put the other subordinate in that position of humility.
So let's shift the conversation now to some solution. So you talked about, there needs to be intervention. So I'm going to start at different levels. So what should we, what should we do what advice can you provide, and as a community, that we should be doing at an individual level, first for males and then for females?
Well, for both males and females together, the Quran tells us in the 33rd chapter that we are to lower our gazes and guard our private parts. So that's our first step and entry point into this. We should take a hands-off approach, not to physically touch the person of the opposite sex unless we are closely related, and in a more intimate way unless we are married to the other person. So taking these measures that are prescribed in the Quran is a first step to minimizing this possibility of harassment. But these are outward steps. We also have to take steps to clean our inner disposition. There's a hadith that says that there is a piece of flesh in the human body. If that is corrupt, then the whole body is corrupt. And the hadith says that is the heart. And on the other hand, if the heart is pure, then the whole body will be pure. The upshot of this is that if one starts with internal purification, then the limbs will follow the mind, which is leading the limbs to do good things. Some of the women who are known from the internet to have complained about their experiences during the Hajj have actually made the same point, and it's a fitting point, that the men who have done this are really corrupt from the inside. Mm-hmm. So regardless of situation, whether they are even in the most holiest place of the Muslim faith, they would be committing such sins.
What about so those are all very valid, important, and fair points, sorry. What about at a community level? What should we be doing?
At a community level, we have to take measures to ensure that women are protected. Now, of course, largely in Muslim societies, the measures have been taken to segregate the men and women precisely to prevent immodest behavior between them. But hardly have the prescriptions been justified from the point of view of preventing harassment. And it now seems that this is a reality, and we must face up to this, that while on the one hand I call for a loosening of restrictions in this way, now I'm looking clear in the face at the real possibility of harassment, and I'm seeing that there is a certain good reason why in traditional Muslim societies the genders have been segregated, and it has helped actually to prevent this kind of molestation. And I'm thinking now about the tawaf of Hajj, the circumambulation around the Kaaba, where men and women walk together in the same open space. I've often thought, well, that seems to be a way in which Islam does not express that restricted segregation. And that seems to be in a way a good thing. But now it would seem that with especially with the crowding being as much as it is nowadays, with 2 million Muslims making the pilgrimage in a year, that now some measures have to be taken in that regard as well to protect the women. Now, in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, it is mentioned that the women used to perform the circumambulation on the outskirts so that it did not mingle in with the men. Could it be the other way around? Could it be that men take it upon themselves to perform the circumambulation on the outskirts so that the women have a shorter path to follow and they are free and safe and they can get up to the Black Stone without any encumbrance or harassment? And of course, men would not voluntarily do this, and even if some men volunteer to do this, some others will not. But perhaps the authorities can create such a space where, at a certain time of day, the women are allowed to perform the tawaf close up to the Kaaba, and men are not allowed at that time, for example. So something like this can be arranged, and it is necessary for the community leaders to step in and put measures in place that will help people to perform their religious duties in the most conscientious way possible, and at the same time for women to be protected from the possibility of such harassment.
How do we address, I think those are all very helpful points. I'll also add, when I went for Hajj this past year, I noticed there were, I think it was the Malaysians, where they would create a boat with the men on the outside and they would keep the women on the inside to sort of, I guess, for protection and not getting trampled on it as well. I guess my other question too is, how do we address the taboo issue where as a community, we don't talk about sexual assault or any of these kinds of things, or feeling comfortable to even come talk to an imam about that. How do we start dealing with that stigma about even talking about this?
I think we have to wake up to the reality that we live in a changing and dynamic world with both its good and bad. And one of the features, whether good or bad, that we notice in our present world is that sexual issues are being discussed in public. And one might be looking at an ad for chewing gum, and it uses that word. So naturally a child will be looking at the ad and asking, "Mommy, what's that word? S-E," and start spelling it out. So are we all going to be in a constant state of embarrassment and recoil from any such discussion? Or are we going to open up discussions with our children that are appropriate for their age level, so that they form a balanced and complete understanding of life and all of its related issues according to their age level, so that there could be a development. It cannot be the case that boys and girls grow up and they experience puberty and they do not even know whether they can talk about some of what they're experiencing. They have to be able to relate to their parents, to their teachers, to their religious leaders, and so such issues need to be addressed even from the pulpit.
And what advice do you have for women? Because I know even with the Mosque, MeToo, and women who experience sexual harassment in the Holy City, they talked about, now when they think about that, their idea of a holy city or pilgrimage is now associated with this incident. So how do you, I guess, what advice do you have there?
First of all, I feel for these women because it's a terrible memory to carry with you after spending that much money and going there, spending your time and thinking that you're going to have a nice religious experience, and then you come back with this horrible memory of being touched in an inappropriate way or even talked to in an inappropriate way in that holiest of holy places. And even if there was no financial consideration, just the idea, you know, I'm shocked to think that this can happen in our holiest of holy places. So my advice is for women to actually come forward and let us know, because unless the voices are many, sometimes nothing is done about it. So the voices have to be many, they have to be loud, they have to be clear, they have to be persistent, and inshallah, God willing, changes will be made.
And seek help for their own
Exactly.
mental health and well-being.
Yes.
And just as we wrap up, one final question for people who haven't experienced this on a personal level or don't know anybody who've dealt with these types of situations, and who might think, you know, well, things like these are the MeToo movement, Mosque MeToo, they're being blown out of proportion. Just because. How would you respond to that?
Well, for the longest time in human history, women suffered from these issues, and there was no venue for women to air their grievances. There was no social media, and these things were just simply brushed aside. And now, perhaps the pendulum has shifted in the other direction to the far extent, and now it's becoming possible for persons to come forward. So in the past, women did not come forward with their grievances because they thought they might not be believed and so on, so they lived with their grief privately. And now, because there is more of a tendency to believe the stories, it is now possible for some to come forward with stories which are not true. This is a possibility. But still, we should look at the general picture and realize that most of the cases have to be true, without saying that this specific one is true until things go to trial and so on. But why would a woman put herself into the spotlight and talk about such things of such a private nature unless they were true? So that's a general situation, though there can be some false claims, and each claim has to be examined on its own. So we should not brush aside the whole movement by saying, no, this is all fake. It cannot all be fake. Most of it is true. But what will happen over time is that as the pendulum was on the far direction one way and now swung to the other direction, eventually it will settle back down in the middle. But that middle will be a balanced understanding that, yes, this is a reality, it is happening, and it's happening more than we should tolerate, much more than we should tolerate, and we cannot tolerate this as a society, whether we're Muslims or not. And especially because we are Muslims, we cannot tolerate such things happening.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.